The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. My name is Ellie Marsh, and I was standing watch on Outpost Varun, a quiet relay station built by the Alliance to keep an eye on trade routes near the edge of known space. Nothing ever happened here. That was the whole point of the job. Until that night. The signal came from Doran, a small farming world 3 jumps away, home to a gentle species called the Veyron. I had visited Doran once. I remembered soft blue grass and children laughing near the river. Now the same channel that once sent me weather updates and trade requests was screaming with static and terror. This is Doran Colony 7. We are under attack. Please, someone, answer us. The voice belonged to a Veyron elder named Kale Doran. I had spoken with him before. He always sounded calm, even when discussing boring trade tariffs. Now his voice cracked with every word. They came from the dark side of our moon. Thousands of them. They are not like anything we have fought before. Please, if anyone can hear this, we need help. I patched the signal straight to the Alliance command channel, the one meant for emergencies only. Within minutes, ambassadors and fleet officers from a dozen species joined the call. I expected ships. I expected orders. I expected someone to move. Instead, I got debate. "We cannot risk our fleet without confirmation of the threat's origin," said a Threll officer, his voice smooth and unbothered. "Sending ships blind could start a larger conflict." "Agreed," said another voice, this one from the Ilvasi delegation. "We must gather more data before committing resources." I sat there, listening to grown officials discuss risk assessments while a planet burned in the background of the call. I could hear explosions through Kale's comlink. I could hear people screaming behind him. "They are already inside the capital," Kale said, his voice shaking. "Please. We do not need data. We need help. Now." Silence. Not the silence of people thinking. The silence of people deciding not to act. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I had spent 3 years working alongside these species, learning their customs, respecting their caution. I always assumed that caution meant wisdom. That night, I learned it could also mean cowardice, dressed up in diplomatic language. "We will convene a formal session within 12 hours to discuss next steps," the Threll officer finally said, as if that solved anything. 12 hours. Kale didn't have 12 minutes. I switched off the main channel before I said something I couldn't take back to a room full of ambassadors who outranked me by every measure that mattered to them. Then I opened a different frequency, one I wasn't technically supposed to use for personal messages. A direct line to Earth Fleet Command. I had family stationed there. My cousin, Daniel Voss, was a commander in the 3rd Fleet. I had never used our connection for anything beyond birthday messages. This felt different. This felt like the only option I had left. "Daniel, it's Ellie," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were not. "I know this isn't protocol. I don't care. There's a planet burning 3 jumps from my post, and the Alliance is holding a meeting about it, instead of sending help. The Veyron are dying right now. I'm sending you everything I have. Please, if there's anything you can do." I attached the coordinates, the distress signal, everything Kale had sent me. Then I sat back and stared at the blinking light that meant the message had been delivered. I had no idea if anyone would even read it before the Alliance finished their 12-hour session, let alone before Doran fell entirely. Kale's voice came through again, weaker this time. "Ellie, are you still there?" "I'm here," I said. "I sent word to Earth. I don't know if they can help. I don't know if anyone can reach you in time." "Earth," he repeated, like he was testing the word. "The young species. The one everyone keeps at a distance." "That's the one," I said. "They say your people are unpredictable, difficult to control, dangerous to provoke." "They say a lot of things," I said. Kale let out a sound that might have been a laugh if the situation had been anything close to normal. Right now, dangerous sounds like exactly what we need. The line crackled, then dropped. My stomach twisted into a knot so tight I thought I might be sick. I tried reconnecting 3 times. Nothing. Just the hiss of dead air where a planet used to be talking. I stayed at my station for the next several hours, watching sensor readings from Doran's system flicker in and out. Every so often a burst of data would come through, showing ship movements, energy signatures, casualty estimates that made my throat tighten. The attackers were something called the Skarn, a swarm species that consumed resources, technology, and apparently people, with the same mindless hunger. No one at the outpost had ever encountered them directly. We only had rumors, passed along from traders who claimed to have seen entire systems stripped bare in a matter of days. I kept refreshing the Alliance channel, hoping someone had changed their mind, hoping the 12-hour session had been moved up. Instead, I found more of the same. Officials discussing jurisdiction, officials discussing the political consequences of intervention, officials discussing everything except the people currently dying. At some point, I must have fallen asleep at my console, because I woke to an alert tone I did not recognize. It wasn't the Alliance distress frequency, it wasn't the Doran channel either. It was a private response, routed through a military relay I had never seen used before, stamped with an Earth Fleet designation. I opened it with hands that were shaking harder than before. Daniel's voice came through, calm in a way that somehow felt louder than shouting. "Ellie, message received. We're already moving. Don't wait for the Alliance to finish talking. Get whatever equipment you have ready. We're bringing everything." I blinked at the screen, not quite believing what I had just heard. There had been no vote, no 12-hour session, no committee weighing risk against reward, just a decision, made and acted on before I had even woken up from an accidental nap at my post. "Everything," I repeated out loud. To no one. What does everything even mean? I got my answer sooner than I expected. Sensor logs began populating on my screen, tracking a fleet formation entering the outer edge of the system, still hours from Doran, but already visible on long-range scans. I had spent years around Alliance ships. I knew their silhouettes, their standard formations, their careful, measured approach patterns designed to minimize risk and maximize negotiation options. This was nothing like that. The formation on my screen moved like a single creature rather than a collection of individual ships, fast, direct, no cautious spacing, no defensive posture, nothing that looked like it was built with retreat in mind. I zoomed in on the ship classifications and felt my mouth go dry. Assault carriers, heavy strike cruisers, vessels with designations I didn't recognize, built from designs that had clearly been developed without asking anyone else's permission first. I thought about Kale's words. Dangerous sounds like exactly what we need. I opened the Alliance channel one more time, mostly out of habit, and found the same officials still debating the same points they had been discussing hours earlier, as if time had simply stopped moving for them while the rest of the galaxy kept spinning without their permission. "Gentlemen," I said, cutting into their conversation without waiting to be acknowledged, "you might want to check your long-range sensors." A pause, then confused murmuring as several delegates apparently did exactly that. "Unidentified fleet approaching Doran system," one of them said slowly. "Origin confirmed as Earth. Ellie Marsh, do you have any information on this deployment? This was not authorized by Joint Command." "No," I said, watching the formation continue its steady, unstoppable approach on my screen. "It wasn't authorized by anyone. It just happened." Nobody on that channel said another word for a long time. I stayed glued to my console as the fleet closed the distance, faster than any Alliance formation I had ever tracked. My mind kept circling back to everything I had ever heard about Earth's military, all the cautious warnings other species shared over drinks at neutral stations. Humans do not calculate risk the way we do. Humans do not wait for consensus before acting. Humans build things the rest of us refuse to build because we understand the cost, and they either do not or simply do not care. I used to think those warnings were meant to keep people wary of humanity. Sitting there that night, watching Earthships burn hard toward a planet everyone else had already written off as lost, I started to wonder if those warnings had actually been meant to keep the rest of the galaxy honest. Kale's line crackled back to life just as the fleet crossed into weapons range of the system's outer defenses. "Ellie," he said, voice barely more than a whisper now, "something is happening. Sensors are picking up new contacts. I do not recognize the signatures." "That's Earth," I said, and for the first time since the alarm first sounded, I felt something other than dread settle into my chest. "That's help." "Help," Kale repeated, and this time there was no doubt or confusion in his voice, only something close to disbelief. The stars were silent for so long, I had stopped expecting an answer. "They're not silent anymore," I said, watching the first wave of Earth ships break formation and dive straight toward the heart of the Skarn swarm without slowing down even once. "Hold on, Kale. Whatever happens next, hold on." The last thing I heard before the channel filled with the roar of distant weapons fire was Kale's voice, quiet and steady, repeating a single word over and over like a prayer he had never expected to need answered. "Monsters." He called them monsters, but he said it the way you might describe a storm arriving just in time to put out a fire that had already taken everything else from you. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding, and watched the true scale of what Earth had sent finally come into view on my screen. Whatever happened next, I understood one thing with complete certainty. The galaxy was about to learn something new about the species everyone had spent so long keeping at arm's length, and I had a front-row seat to watch it happen. The Alliance channel exploded with noise the moment Earth's fleet crossed into the Doran system. "This deployment violates 7 separate treaties," the Threll officer said, his calm voice finally cracking under pressure. "Unauthorized military action in a neutral system could trigger consequences none of us are prepared for." "The consequence of doing nothing was already happening," I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "You had 12 hours scheduled for discussion. They didn't wait 12 minutes. Nobody answered me. I didn't expect them to. I turned my attention back to the sensor feed, watching Kale's tiny colony marker still blinking on the map, still alive, still holding on. I had grown up hearing stories about Earth, the way most people across the Alliance did. Humans were the newest species to join galactic society, and they carried a reputation that made older, more established powers uneasy. Every species I had worked with treated Earth the same way you might treat a powerful animal you respected but did not fully trust. Capable, certainly, useful in the right circumstances, but unpredictable in a way that made careful diplomats nervous. I remembered a conversation I once had with an Ilvasi trade official named Sona Vex, back when I first started working this post. We had been discussing crew assignments over evening rations, and she had asked, almost casually, whether I found my own species difficult to understand. "Difficult how?" I had asked her. "Your people do not calculate the way we do," she said. "When we face a threat, we measure the cost of every action. Humans measure the cost of inaction instead. It makes you generous. It also makes you frightening." I hadn't understood what she meant back then. Watching Earth's fleet burn toward Doran without pause, without hesitation, without waiting for anyone's permission, I finally did. The formation split as it entered the system, breaking into smaller groups that moved with a kind of coordinated aggression I had never seen from any Alliance fleet. Most military doctrines I had studied emphasized caution, staged advances, careful retreats if the odds turned unfavorable. This was different. This looked like a group of people who had already decided retreat was not an option worth considering. I pulled up ship designations as fast as the data came in, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The lead vessels were massive assault carriers, built wide and heavy, clearly designed to absorb punishment rather than avoid it. Behind them came smaller strike cruisers, faster and more maneuverable, weaving through space in patterns that reminded me of predators closing in on cornered prey rather than soldiers executing a careful battle plan. "Ellie," Kale's voice came through again, weaker than before, but still holding on. "The new arrivals. They are engaging the swarm directly. No warning shots, no attempt at negotiation." "That's not really how they operate," I said, watching the first exchange of weapons fire light up my screen in a burst of static. "When humans decide to help, They don't ease into it. Is that meant to be reassuring? It's meant to be honest, I said. I switched to a secondary feed that Daniel had patched through to me, a live tactical display used by Earth Fleet Command. It showed the battle unfolding in real time, and even filtered through layers of military encryption, I could feel the intensity behind every movement. The Skarn swarm, thousands of individual vessels linked together in some kind of collective hive intelligence, had never encountered an enemy willing to close distance this quickly. Their formations, built around overwhelming numbers and coordinated waves, faltered the moment Earth's ships refused to slow down or spread out the way every other species instinctively did when facing superior numbers. I watched one of the heavy assault carriers, designated Ironclad 6 according to the display, take a direct hit from what looked like a concentrated energy weapon. Any Alliance vessel I had ever studied would have been crippled, forced into retreat, its crew doing everything possible to preserve the ship and its people. Ironclad 6 kept moving forward, absorbing the damage, continuing its advance toward the heart of the swarm formation, as if the hit had barely registered. "They're not falling back," I said out loud, mostly to myself. "Should they be?" Kale asked. "By every rule I've ever been taught, yes," I said. "That's what makes this different." I thought about all the briefings I had sat through during training, lessons on tactical withdrawal, on preserving forces, on understanding when a battle was not worth the cost of winning. Every species in the Alliance operated by some version of those principles. Losses were measured, weighed, factored into decisions before they were made. Watching Earth's fleet continue its advance despite mounting damage, I understood that humans measured the cost differently, not the cost of the battle, the cost of walking away from people who needed help. Daniel's voice cut through the tactical channel, steady despite the chaos visible on every screen around him. "Ellie, you still monitoring this?" "I'm here," I said. "What am I looking at, Daniel?" "This isn't standard doctrine. This isn't anything I've studied. It's not supposed to be standard," he said. "The Skarn have never fought anyone who refuses to slow down. Every species they've encountered plays it safe, measures the risk, pulls back when the numbers stop favoring them. We don't fight that way when there are civilians on the ground. We can't." "Why not?" I asked, genuinely curious despite the tension pressing against my chest. There was a pause before Daniel answered, and when he did, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard from him before. "Because the moment you start measuring civilian lives against acceptable losses, you've already lost something that matters more than the battle," he said. "We don't do that math. We can't. Command decided a long time ago that if we're going to answer a distress call, we answer it completely, or we don't answer it at all." I sat with that for a long moment, watching the battle continue to unfold across two different screens, one showing cold tactical data, the other showing Kale's small, stubborn colony marker still blinking on the map. The Skarn formation, built around numbers and coordination, began to show cracks under the relentless pressure of Earth's advance. Ships that had operated as a single collective intelligence started making disjointed, uncertain movements, as if the hive mind itself was struggling to process an enemy that refused to follow any pattern it had encountered before. "Ellie," Kale said suddenly, urgency creeping back into his voice. "The attacks on the ground have stopped. The swarm units near the capital have withdrawn." "Withdrawn where?" I asked. "Back toward orbit," he said. "I believe your people are drawing them away from us." I pulled up the tactical display again and saw exactly what Kale described. Earth's ships had shifted their formation, deliberately positioning themselves between the planet and the retreating swarm units, forcing every engagement to happen in open space rather than anywhere near the colony below. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't luck. It was a decision, made in real time, to absorb the fighting themselves rather than let it continue near civilians who had nowhere left to run. "They're protecting the planet directly," I said, more to myself than to Kale. "Is that unusual?" he asked. "For most fleets, yes," I said. "Most military doctrines prioritize destroying the enemy force, even if that means the fighting spills over onto the ground below. This is different. This is deliberate." I watched Ironclad 6 take another hit, this one worse than the last, venting atmosphere from a breach along its hull that lit up bright against the darkness of space. My chest tightened as I imagined the people aboard that ship, and I found myself hoping, almost against my own training, that whatever damage control systems they had would hold long enough. "Daniel," I said into the comm, unable to keep the worry out of my voice. "Ironclad 6 just took a serious hit." "I see it," he said, his voice tight but controlled. "Crew status is being monitored. They're not falling back either." "Why not?" I asked again, even though some part of me already suspected the answer. "Because there's still a job to do," he said simply. I didn't have a response to that. I just watched, feeling the weight of every second stretch out longer than it should have, as Earth's ships continued their advance, despite mounting damage, despite the kind of losses that would have forced any other fleet to reconsider its position hours ago. Kale's voice came through again, quieter this time, almost reverent. "Ellie, I need to ask you something," he said. "Why would your people risk so much for a world they have never seen, for people they have never met?" I thought about the question longer than I probably needed to, watching the battle rage on in front of me, watching a species everyone else in the galaxy kept describing as dangerous throw themselves into a fight they had no obligation to join. "I think that's exactly why," I finally said, "because nobody made them do this. Because they looked at your distress call and decided that was reason enough." Kale didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice carried something I hadn't heard from him before. Not fear, not gratitude exactly, but something closer to disbelief mixed with a strange kind of hope. "The stars were silent when we needed them most," he said. "I did not expect an answer to come wrapped in something the rest of the galaxy fears." "Maybe that's exactly what an answer looks like sometimes," I said, watching the tactical display shift again as more of the swarm formation began to buckle under the relentless pressure of Earth's advance. "Sometimes help doesn't look gentle. Sometimes it just looks like someone refusing to stop." Outside my window, far beyond anything my own eyes could see, I knew the battle was still raging, ships trading fire in the silent dark, humans bleeding and burning and refusing to retreat for a planet that wasn't even theirs. I stayed at my console long into what should have been my off shift, unwilling to look away, unwilling to stop watching the moment the galaxy learned exactly what kind of answer Earth had decided to send. By the time the sun rose over Outpost Varun, I had made a decision that surprised even me. I requested transport to Doran. My supervisor, an older Threll officer named Dros Elon, looked at me like I had lost my mind when I submitted the request. "You are a communications liaison, Ellie, not a field officer. There is nothing useful you can do down there." "I can be a witness," I said. "Someone needs to see this firsthand instead of reading reports filtered through 6 layers of committee approval." He didn't approve the request. He also didn't stop me from boarding a supply shuttle that Daniel arranged personally, cutting through more red tape in one phone call than I had managed in 3 years of asking politely. Within 6 hours, I was strapped into a jump seat aboard a transport vessel, watching the swirling blue and green surface of Doran grow larger through a reinforced window, still smoking in places where the fighting had been heaviest. The shuttle set down at a forward staging area just outside what remained of Colony 7, and the first thing I noticed stepping off the ramp was the smell. Burnt metal, scorched earth, something sharper underneath that I didn't want to think too hard about. The second thing I noticed was the sound, not screaming anymore, something quieter and somehow harder to listen to, the low murmur of people trying to comfort each other in a language I only partly understood. A young human soldier met me at the edge of the staging area, her uniform scuffed and stained, her expression alert, despite what must have been hours without rest. Her name tag read Kilby. "You're the liaison," she said, not really a question. "Commander Voss said you'd be coming. Stay close to me, ma'am. We've cleared this sector, but there's still cleanup happening near the eastern ridge." "Cleanup," I repeated. "Stragglers," she said simply. "Small groups that got separated from the main swarm formation when it broke apart, mostly disoriented, not much fight left in them. I followed her through what used to be a market square, now littered with debris and the occasional Veyron family sitting huddled together near makeshift shelters that human engineers had erected sometime overnight. Children peered out from behind their parents, watching us pass with wide, cautious eyes. "How many?" I asked quietly. "How many did we lose?" Kilby's jaw tightened slightly before she answered. "Colony population before the attack was around 40,000. Current count is holding steady around 36,000 and rising as we pull more survivors from shelters. Could have been a lot worse. Could have been a lot worse. Felt like such a strange thing to say about 4,000 missing people, but I understood what she meant. I had seen the alternative sitting silent on Alliance channels for 12 hours while officials debated jurisdiction. We reached a command post set up in what used to be a town hall, its windows blown out, but its structure still standing. Inside, I found Daniel hunched over a tactical display alongside several other officers, all of them looking like they hadn't slept in longer than any of us should admit. "Ellie," he said, straightening when he saw me. Surprise flickered across his face before settling into something closer to resignation. "You actually came. Someone needed to see this," I said. "Not through a screen, not through a report." He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Stay close to Kilby. We're still finishing up in the eastern sector. After that, I'll walk you through everything myself." I spent the next several hours doing exactly what he asked, staying close to Kilby as she and her unit moved through the remains of Colony 7, coordinating search efforts, helping stabilize damaged shelters, occasionally responding to reports of scattered swarm units still lingering in less accessible areas. What struck me most wasn't the destruction, though there was plenty of that to see. It was the way the soldiers around me moved between two completely different modes of behavior without any visible transition. I watched Kilby help an elderly Veyron woman down from an unstable ledge, her voice gentle, patient, adjusting her grip carefully to avoid causing further injury to the woman's already damaged leg. 20 minutes later, I watched the same soldier respond to a report of movement near the ridge, her posture shifting instantly into something sharper, more controlled, more dangerous. "Contact confirmed," someone called over the comm. "Two stragglers, eastern slope." Kilby's team moved with a coordination that felt almost eerie in its precision, covering ground quickly, communicating through short, clipped phrases that conveyed entire tactical decisions in just a few words. I stayed back as instructed, watching from a safe distance as the engagement unfolded and ended within minutes, the threat neutralized with an efficiency that left no room for hesitation or doubt. When Kilby returned, her expression had already softened back into the same patient calm she'd shown the elderly woman earlier. "You all right, ma'am?" she asked me, apparently noticing something in my expression. "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "That was fast." "We train for fast," she said. "Slow gets people killed. Ours and theirs, both." I thought about that phrase for a long time afterward. Ours and theirs, both. Not just Earth soldiers, the Veyron too, folded into the same category of people worth protecting, worth moving quickly for, worth taking every risk to save. Later that evening, Daniel found time to walk me through the broader tactical situation, pulling up a display that showed the full scope of what had happened over the past 24 hours. The Skarn swarm, once numbering in the thousands, had been reduced to scattered fragments, most of them retreating toward the outer edge of the system where a secondary human fleet waited to intercept anything trying to escape. "How many ships did we lose?" I asked, studying the display carefully. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. 12 vessels destroyed outright, another 9 damaged badly enough to require extensive repair. Ironclad 6 survived, barely, lost about a third of her crew in the process. I felt my stomach drop at the number. A third. "They held the line anyway," he said. "Kept the swarm from reaching the ground forces during the critical window, when civilians were still being evacuated. Their captain made the call to stay in position even after the hull breach. Could have pulled back. Chose not to." "Why?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected I knew the answer by now. because pulling back meant the swarm would have reached the evacuation zone before ground forces finished clearing it. Daniel said. The math was simple: stay and hold, accept heavy losses, protect the evacuation, or retreat, preserve the ship, and let however many thousand people down there pay the price instead. That's an impossible choice, I said quietly. It's the choice we train for, he said. Every officer knows what's expected the moment civilians are on the line. We don't calculate acceptable losses against people who can't defend themselves. We accept the losses ourselves instead. I sat with that for a long moment, watching the tactical display continue updating with new information, casualty reports, damage assessments, the slow, methodical process of accounting for everything that had been spent to keep Doran's remaining population alive. The Alliance is going to have questions, I finally said, about the treaty violations, about unauthorized deployment into a neutral system. Daniel's expression turned wry, tired, but not without some dark humor buried underneath. Let them ask. We'll have plenty of answers ready. Most of them wearing Veyron faces, still breathing, still standing on ground that would have been empty otherwise. Kale found me later that night, moving slowly through the temporary shelter area on a leg that had clearly been treated by human medical staff at some point during the day. He looked exhausted in a way that seemed to reach past simple physical fatigue, something deeper, something that came from watching your entire world nearly end and somehow surviving anyway. Ellie, he said, settling carefully onto a supply crate beside where I was sitting, I wanted to thank you properly, for sending that message, for not waiting for the Alliance to finish their session. I didn't do much, I said. I just refused to stay quiet. That was enough, he said. More than enough, it turns out. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching human medical teams move between shelters, tending to injuries, distributing supplies, coordinating with Veyron volunteers who had started helping wherever they could despite their own exhaustion. Somewhere nearby, a group of children had gathered around a young human soldier who was teaching them some kind of simple hand game, their laughter cutting through the otherwise somber mood of the camp like a small, stubborn light, refusing to be extinguished. I have been thinking about something you said earlier, Kale continued after a while. About your people measuring the cost of inaction rather than action. I didn't come up with that, I admitted. Someone else told me something similar once. I just finally understood what she meant. I think I understand it now too, Kale said. We spent so long believing caution was the same as wisdom. Perhaps it is, sometimes. But watching your people fight for us today, I wonder if caution can also become its own kind of failure, dressed up in careful language that makes it easier to live with. I didn't have a response to that. I just watched the camp continue its slow work of recovery, humans and Veyron moving together through debris and grief, and small moments of unexpected kindness, and I understood, more clearly than I ever had before, exactly what Daniel meant when he talked about the choice Earth had made a long time ago. Answer completely, or don't answer at all. Later, as the sky over Doran darkened into evening, word came through that the last of the scattered Skarn fragments had either been destroyed or driven far enough from the system to no longer pose an immediate threat. The formal battle was over. What remained was the much longer, much quieter work of rebuilding everything that had been lost, tending to everyone who had been hurt, and figuring out how to carry forward from a day none of us would ever forget. I stood near the edge of the camp as the last light faded, watching Ironclad 6 pass silently overhead on its way toward a repair station somewhere beyond the horizon, her hull scarred but intact, carrying home whatever remained of the crew who had chosen to stay and hold the line instead of pulling back to save themselves. I thought about everything I had witnessed over the past day, the debate, the silence, the sudden arrival, the relentless advance, the soldiers who moved seamlessly between gentleness and violence, depending on exactly what the moment required. I thought about Kale's word from the night before, the one he had used almost like a prayer. Monsters. Watching that battered ship disappear beyond the horizon, carrying home its wounded and its dead, I found myself thinking that maybe he had been right to use that word after all. Not because it was cruel, or savage, or anything close to what the term usually implied, but because sometimes the only thing standing between complete destruction and survival is something willing to become whatever the moment demands, no matter the cost to itself. The stars had been silent when Doran needed them most. Earth had answered anyway, wrapped in a shape the rest of the galaxy still didn't quite know how to understand. 3 days after the battle ended, I found myself walking through the medical bay of a repair station orbiting just beyond Doran, the same station where Ironclad 6 had limped in for treatment after the fighting stopped. The corridors smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, and every few steps I passed rooms filled with injured crew members, some resting quietly, others surrounded by medical staff working through slow, careful treatments. I hadn't planned on visiting. Daniel had asked if I wanted to see the human side of what recovery actually looked like, away from tactical displays and casualty numbers that reduced everything to statistics. "You don't have to come," he had told me. "It's not easy to see." "I've spent this whole week watching things that weren't easy to see," I said. "I'd rather understand the whole picture than only the parts that felt clean." Nothing about it felt clean. I passed a young man missing part of his left arm below the elbow, sitting quietly while a nurse adjusted the bandages, his face calm in a way that somehow felt more unsettling than if he had been in visible distress. I passed a woman whose burns covered most of one side of her face, her eyes still sharp and alert despite everything, watching the corridor with the same careful attention I imagined she had used during the battle itself. Kilby found me near the end of the corridor, sitting on a bench outside one of the recovery rooms, her uniform replaced with simple medical scrubs, a bandage wrapped around her forearm. "Didn't expect to see you up here, ma'am," she said, shifting over to make room on the bench. "Daniel thought I should see this part too," I said, sitting down beside her. "Not just the battle, the after." "The after is the part nobody really wants to talk about," she said. "Easier to focus on the numbers. Ships saved, colonies protected, threats eliminated. Harder to sit with what it actually costs to get those numbers." I studied the bandage on her arm. "Are you all right?" "This is nothing," she said, waving it off. "Lost some good people, though. Ironclad 6 took the worst of it. A third of her crew, gone or wounded, bad enough they won't be flying again for a long while." I thought about the number Daniel had given me earlier, a third of the crew. Hearing it again from someone who had actually served alongside people who fell within that count made it feel heavier somehow, less like a statistic and more like a weight settling directly onto my chest. "Was it worth it?" I asked, immediately regretting the question the moment it left my mouth. It felt too simple, too reductive for everything I had witnessed over the past few days. Kilby didn't seem offended by it, though. She just considered the question carefully before answering. 36,000 people are still alive down there because we held that line. I think about it that way. Not whether it was worth it in some abstract sense, just whether we did what needed doing when it mattered. "And did you?" "Yeah," she said quietly. "We did." We sat together for a while longer, watching medical staff move between rooms, watching families of injured crew members arrive to sit beside their loved ones, some crying quietly, others simply holding hands in silence. It struck me how ordinary it all looked, despite everything extraordinary that had led to this moment. Just people, tired and hurting, trying to comfort each other the same way people had always done, regardless of species, regardless of what had brought them to this point. Later that day, I found myself in a different section of the station, a temporary housing area where some of the youngest Doran survivors had been brought for additional medical evaluation after the evacuation. Kale had mentioned that a small group of orphan children were being cared for here, kids who had lost parents or guardians during the attack and were still waiting for extended family to be located. I hadn't planned on visiting this section either, but something drew me there anyway. Maybe some need to see a part of the aftermath that wasn't measured in casualty reports or crew statistics. I found a small common area where several children sat quietly, some playing with simple toys that had clearly been improvised from spare materials, others just sitting close to each other in silence. One girl, who couldn't have been more than 7 years old by Veyron standards, sat apart from the group, hugging her knees to her chest, staring at nothing in particular. A young human soldier sat down carefully beside her, keeping a respectful distance, not saying anything at first, just sitting quietly nearby. I recognized him after a moment. His name was Marcus Kilby, Kilby's younger brother, apparently also serving aboard one of the vessels that had responded to the distress call. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," he said softly, his voice gentle, in a way that felt worlds apart from the sharp, controlled tone I had heard from soldiers during active engagements. "I just didn't want you sitting alone." The girl, whose name I later learned was Suri, didn't answer right away. She kept staring at the floor, her small hands gripping her knees tightly. "My mother," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "She told me to run. She said she would follow. She never came." Marcus didn't offer any easy reassurances, didn't try to fill the silence with comforting lies about things being all right. He just nodded slowly, letting the weight of what she said settle without rushing past it. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I wish I could tell you something that would make that easier to carry. I can't, but you're not alone right now, and you won't be for as long as you need someone here." Suri looked up at him for the first time, her eyes red and tired, but studying him carefully, as if trying to understand something about him that she couldn't quite put into words. "Everyone says your people are dangerous," she said quietly, "that you fight like something wild, something that doesn't stop." Marcus considered that for a moment before answering. "Maybe that's true, when it needs to be. But I think the only reason we fight that way is so that kids like you get to sit here, safe, instead of somewhere much worse." Suri didn't say anything else for a long while, but eventually, slowly, she shifted closer to him, resting her head against his arm. He didn't move, didn't say anything more, just let her stay there, offering quiet, steady presence in place of words that couldn't possibly fix what had been broken. I stood a short distance away, watching this small moment unfold, feeling something in my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with tactical concerns or diplomatic consequences. This was the part of the story that would never make it into any official report, the part that existed entirely outside casualty numbers and treaty violations and alliance debates about jurisdiction. Daniel found me there sometime later, watching quietly from the doorway as I had been. "This is the part people don't usually see," he said quietly, following my gaze toward where Marcus still sat with Suri, both of them quiet now, comfortable in each other's presence despite everything that had happened. "Everyone focuses on the fighting. Nobody talks about this part." "Maybe they should," I said. "This feels just as important." "Maybe more important," Daniel said. "The fighting stops eventually. This part, the after, this is what actually determines whether any of it meant something." We stood together for a while longer, watching the quiet scene continue to unfold, before Daniel spoke again, his voice more serious this time. "There's something else you should know," he said, "something that hasn't reached the wider alliance channels yet." "What is it?" I asked, feeling a familiar tightness return to my chest. "The Skarn swarm that attacked Doran wasn't an isolated incident," he said. "Command has been tracking similar patterns across several other systems near the edge of Alliance space. Smaller distress calls, some of them ignored the same way Doran's was initially ignored. I felt something cold settle over me at that. How many? At least 4 other systems in the past month alone, he said. Most of them too small or too far removed from major trade routes for the Alliance to consider intervention worth the political cost. And Earth, I asked. Is Command planning to respond to those as well? Daniel's expression turned firm, resolute in a way that left little room for doubt. We already have ships moving toward 2 of them. The other 2, we're still gathering information, but the answer isn't going to be no. It was never going to be no. I thought about everything I had witnessed over the past several days, the silence on Alliance channels, the sudden overwhelming response from Earth, the cost paid by soldiers who chose to hold their ground rather than retreat, the quiet moment between Marcus and Suri that meant more to me than any tactical victory ever could. "The Alliance is going to have a lot to answer for," I said quietly. "Once people start asking why it took a species everyone kept describing as dangerous to actually show up when it mattered." "Let them ask," Daniel said, echoing what he had told me before. "We'll keep answering the calls either way." Later that evening, as I prepared to return to Outpost Varun, Kale found me one last time near the transport bay, his legs still healing, but his voice stronger than it had been since the attack first began. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," he said, "and to ask you something if you don't mind." "Of course," I said. "When the next distress call comes, from wherever it comes," he said, "will your people answer again?" I thought about Daniel's words, about the ships already moving toward other systems, about the choice Earth had made a long time ago to answer completely or not answer at all. "Yes," I said, with more certainty than I had felt about almost anything else in my life. "They will." Kale nodded slowly, something like relief settling over his tired features. "Then perhaps the stars are not as silent as they once seemed. Perhaps they simply needed the right voice to break that silence." I boarded my transport back to Outpost Varun with that thought settling heavily in my mind, carrying with me everything I had witnessed, the courage and the cost, the violence and the gentleness, the species everyone feared finally showing the galaxy exactly what that fear had always been hiding underneath it. 6 months passed before I understood just how far the story of Doran had traveled. I was back at my post on Outpost Varun, settled into the familiar rhythm of monitoring trade routes and relay signals, when a message came through from an old colleague I hadn't spoken to in years. Her name was Nadia Voss, no relation to Daniel despite the shared surname, an Alliance diplomat stationed several sectors away on a station near the Ilvasi core worlds. "Ellie," her message began, "you won't believe what people are saying out here. The story about Doran has spread further than I think anyone expected." I opened the attached files she had sent along, a collection of news reports and diplomatic memos from systems I had never even visited, all of them referencing the events at Doran in some form or another. Some accounts were accurate, describing the timeline of the attack and the response with reasonable precision. Others had grown into something closer to legend, exaggerated details layered on top of already remarkable facts, until the story took on an almost mythical quality. One report, originating from a small trading outpost near the Outer Rim, described the battle in terms that made me laugh out loud, despite the seriousness of everything that had actually happened. According to this particular account, Earth's fleet had arrived not within hours of the distress call, but within minutes, materializing out of nowhere as if summoned by the sheer desperation of the request itself. Another account, this one from a more reputable source within the Threll diplomatic corps, focused less on exaggeration and more on the uncomfortable questions the incident had raised across Alliance leadership. Why had established powers, species that had known each other for centuries, hesitated so completely while a species barely a few decades into galactic society acted without hesitation? Why had caution, so carefully cultivated as a diplomatic virtue, produced nothing but silence when silence cost thousands of lives? I forwarded these reports to Daniel, curious what he made of the growing attention. "Command is aware," he responded a few hours later. "There's been increased interest from several smaller species who previously avoided direct contact with Earth. Seems like word of Doran reached places we never expected it to reach." "What kind of interest?" I asked. "Requests for information," he said. "Some formal, through proper channels, others less official. Private inquiries from smaller colonies, wondering what it would take to establish a direct line of communication with Earth Fleet Command, separate from the usual Alliance bureaucracy." I thought about that for a long moment, remembering the 12-hour session the Alliance had scheduled while Doran burned, remembering every layer of careful procedure that had nearly cost thousands of lives before Earth cut through all of it with a single unauthorized decision. "They want a shortcut," I said, "a way to reach help without waiting for permission from everyone else first." "Can't say I blame them," Daniel said. Over the following weeks, I began noticing subtle shifts in how various species approached their interactions with Earth representatives across different outposts and relay stations. Species that had once maintained careful, guarded distance began extending more direct invitations for cooperation. Trade negotiations that previously required extensive diplomatic buffering started happening with less formality, less hesitation, as if the wall of careful suspicion that had always surrounded humanity had developed a crack that kept slowly widening. Not everyone welcomed this shift. I received word through official channels that several Alliance leadership councils had grown increasingly concerned about what they described as Earth's growing influence following the Doran incident. Formal complaints were filed regarding the unauthorized deployment into a neutral system. Committees were convened to discuss appropriate consequences for violating established protocols. I sat in on one such session remotely, listening as various delegates debated the appropriate response to what they continued calling an unauthorized military action, despite the fact that the unauthorized action in question had directly resulted in the survival of an entire civilian population. "We cannot simply ignore the precedent this sets," the Threll representative argued during the session. "If Earth continues acting unilaterally whenever they deem a situation urgent enough, what remains of coordinated alliance policy? And if we continue debating jurisdiction while civilians die waiting for our permission," I said, unable to stay quiet despite technically being present only as an observer, "what exactly are we protecting by maintaining that policy?" The room fell silent for a moment before the session moved on to other matters, but I noticed several delegates exchanging glances that suggested my question had landed somewhere it wasn't entirely welcome. Kale reached out to me periodically during this time, updating me on Doran's slow recovery. The colony had rebuilt much of what was lost, though scars remained, both physical and otherwise. Suri, the young girl I had met during my visit to the medical station, had been placed with an extended family member who had survived the attack, though according to Kale, she still asked frequently about the human soldiers who had helped her during those difficult days. "She keeps a small token Marcus gave her before he shipped out," Kale told me during one of our calls. "Some kind of simple medal from his uniform. She says it reminds her that help arrived when she needed it most, even when she thought no one was coming." I thought about that detail often over the following months. That small physical reminder, carried by a child who had lost everything except the memory of someone choosing to sit beside her when the world had nothing left to offer. The larger consequences of Doran continued unfolding gradually across the following year. 2 more distress calls, similar in nature to what had happened at Doran, came through Alliance channels during that time. Both times, the same pattern repeated itself with slight variations. Alliance leadership hesitated, calculating risk, discussing jurisdiction. Earth responded within hours, sometimes minutes, without waiting for anyone's approval. The pattern became so consistent that eventually, smaller species along the Alliance periphery began adjusting their own emergency protocols, quietly establishing direct lines to Earth Fleet Command alongside their official Alliance channels, treating the human response almost as a backup system for when official diplomatic processes moved too slowly to matter. I remember discussing this shift with Nadia during one of our increasingly frequent conversations, both of us watching from our respective outposts as the broader implications continued to unfold. "It's strange," she said during one call, "watching an entire diplomatic order slowly reorganize itself around the reality that one species keeps proving willing to act while everyone else keeps proving reluctant." "Is it strange?" I asked. "Or is it just honest?" "Maybe both," she said. "I think a lot of us grew up believing caution was the mark of a mature civilization. Watching humans repeatedly demonstrate that urgency and mercy matter more than careful procedure, it forces you to reconsider some fairly deep assumptions." I thought about Sona Vex's words from years earlier, the ones that had never quite made sense to me until I watched Earth's fleet burn toward Doran without hesitation. Humans measure the cost of inaction rather than action. It makes them generous. It also makes them frightening. I finally understood, fully and completely, exactly what she had meant. Nearly a year after the events at Doran, I received an update that struck me more deeply than almost anything else that had happened since. A new distress call had come through Alliance channels, this one from a small mining colony on the far edge of known space, a species I had never even heard of before that moment. As had become the unfortunate pattern, Alliance leadership hesitated, debating jurisdiction and appropriate response protocols while the situation continued deteriorating. This time, though, something different happened. Before Earth Fleet Command could even respond, several smaller Alliance member species began independently mobilizing whatever limited military resources they possessed, moving toward the threatened colony without waiting for official Alliance authorization. When I asked Daniel about it later, his response carried something I hadn't quite expected. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet satisfaction. Seems Doran taught more than just the smaller species that waiting isn't always the responsible choice, he said. A few of the mid-tier Alliance members decided they'd rather act and answer for it afterward than watch another colony burn while everyone debates procedure. You think that's because of what happened at Doran? I asked. I think, he said carefully, that sometimes all it takes is watching someone else prove that a different choice is possible. Once people see it done, really see it, it becomes a lot harder to convince yourself that the old way was ever the only option. I sat with that thought for a long time after our conversation ended, watching the quiet activity of my outpost continue around me, remembering the night everything had started, the silence on Alliance channels while Kale's voice cracked with desperation, the moment Daniel's message came through telling me Earth was already moving before anyone had even finished debating whether they should. The mining colony survived, though not without losses. Earth's fleet arrived eventually, joining the smaller forces already engaged, turning what could have been another devastating defeat into a costly but ultimately successful defense. The story spread again, adding another chapter to what had slowly become something like legend among the smaller species scattered across Alliance space. I thought often, during the months that followed, about the word Kale had used that very first night, the one that had stuck with me ever since. Monsters. He hadn't meant it as an insult, not really, even in that moment of exhausted desperation. He had meant something closer to awe, mixed with fear, the recognition that sometimes salvation doesn't arrive wearing a gentle face. Sometimes it arrives exactly the way you need it to, fierce and unstoppable and completely unwilling to calculate the cost of caring too much. I still work at Outpost Varan, monitoring trade routes and relay signals, though my role has expanded somewhat since that first night everything changed. I serve now as an informal point of contact between smaller Alliance species and Earth Fleet Command, helping bridge the gap between careful diplomatic protocol and the kind of immediate, unhesitating response that has become Earth's quiet trademark across this stretch of the galaxy. Kale still contacts me occasionally, updating me on Doran's continued recovery, sharing small details about Suri's progress as she grows older, still carrying that small token from a soldier who chose to sit beside her during the worst days of her young life. The colony has rebuilt, stronger in some ways than before, carrying forward the memory of what happened without letting that memory define them entirely. Sometimes, late at night, monitoring quiet channels that rarely carry anything more urgent than routine trade updates, I think back to that first distress call, the desperation in Kale's voice, the careful, measured silence of officials more concerned with procedure than survival. I think about the moment I broke protocol myself, sending a personal message straight to Earth, rather than waiting for permission that might never have come in time. I think about everything that followed, the relentless advance of a fleet that refused to calculate acceptable losses, the soldiers who moved seamlessly between gentleness and violence, depending on what each moment required, the quiet aftermath, filled with grief and recovery, and small, unexpected moments of comfort between people who had never expected to need each other quite so badly. The stars had been silent that night, wrapped in careful diplomatic caution that nearly cost an entire civilization everything it had. Earth answered anyway, not because anyone told them to, not because careful calculation determined it was the wise choice, but simply because someone had asked for help, and that had been reason enough. I still catch myself wondering sometimes what the galaxy might have looked like if that silence had continued a little longer, if Earth's response had come an hour later, a day later, too late to matter at all. I don't like sitting with that particular thought for very long. I prefer instead to remember what actually happened, the moment hope arrived wrapped in something the rest of the galaxy still struggled to fully understand. Recently, another message came through my station, this one from a system even farther out than the mining colony, another small voice calling for help while larger powers debated whether responding was worth the political cost. I know already what will happen next. I have watched this same story unfold enough times now to recognize every beat of it before it even begins. The Alliance will hesitate. They will schedule their careful sessions, weigh their careful risks, debate their careful protocols. And somewhere, quietly, without waiting for anyone's permission, Earth's ships will already be moving. I sat back at my console, watching the new distress signal blink steadily across my screen, and found myself smiling despite the gravity of the situation. The stars might stay silent for a little while longer, but I already knew exactly who would answer once that silence finally broke, and I found myself, for the first time in a very long while, feeling something that felt remarkably close to hope.